I'm very happy to be part of this today, and on behalf of myself and our OMF Chair, Ed Mikowski, we welcome you to the series of OMF Timely subject on hybrid meetings. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Chris Carnahan. Chris is an Assistant Vice President at the Aerospace Industries Association. He's responsible for AIA's program that provides standards to the aerospace and defense industry, which are critical to the manufacture and operations of civilian and military aircraft and spacecraft. Chris supports a number of AIA committees and is committee manager for 2 aerospace-related ISO committees. He's a member of the ANSI International Forum, AIF, and ANSI ISO Council, AIC, and serves as a board member for SES, the Society for Standards Professionals, and in 2020, Chris became an SES fellow. Without anything else, I'll just pass it on to Chris, who will kick off our panel discussion and introduce our panelists. Chris?
Great, thanks, Sarah. Hey, welcome everybody. Give me one quick second here. All right, so we are at an exciting time where we actually have the technology that makes hybrid meetings possible. But let's be honest, hybrid meetings are a pain. They take extra planning. With that technology that can break, it requires more staff and volunteer resources. However, hybrid meetings are becoming more of a reality in our world, and those who can do hybrid meetings best will differentiate themselves from the rest and be more effective in the services that they can provide. So today we're going to focus on best practices for committee leaders and staff running hybrid meetings. Our panelists will focus on different aspects of running hybrid meetings, from the planning to actually running the meetings, and to the overall mindset of different types of participants for those who are remote versus those who are in person. Our panelists have a lot of experience with hybrid meetings, and I'm excited for us to explore this area together. We will have time at the end to ask questions of the panelists. What I would ask you to do is please use the chat. So after the 3 presentations and a demo, you'll be feel free to use the chat or to use the raise hand feature so we can have an orderly Q&A session. Myself and ANSI staff, so Michelle, will monitor the chat, and then we'll also keep an eye on the participant list to see who has a question. But in addition, if you have a hybrid meeting suggestion or best practice that is not mentioned, feel free to contribute that to the discussion by adding that to the chat. So to get us started, please allow me to introduce our panel. We'll do some quick introductions to save time so that they can jump right in. So our first panelist is Monica Leslie, Operations Manager for Standards at NSF International. Welcome, Monica. Our second panelist is Mark Czar, Standards Specialist with SAE International. Thank you for joining us, Mark. And thank you. Yep. And our third panelist is Laura Brumsey, Vice President for Operations and Administration at the Compressed Gas Association. Laura, welcome. So to get us started, Monica will go first, and then Mark, and then Laura. So Monica, please go ahead.
All right, thanks, Chris. So as he said, I'm Monica Leslie with NSF International. I've been facilitating these types of hybrid meetings for over a decade now, and I would say they run the gamut from a very small task group of 5 to 10 members, all the way up to large committee meetings that might have 100 to 120 participants, which may include 70 to 80 people on site in the meeting room, and then another 20 or 30 people online. we were asked to maybe talk about a little crash and burn type story or a mishap that we've had over the years. And I think we've all had technical difficulties if you've run a virtual meeting or hybrid meeting. But one that comes to mind actually is more of a user error than anything that a technical problem. And that was many years ago, I inadvertently created 2 different meeting codes for the same meeting. And it took about 10 minutes to figure out why half the participants weren't able to, or they claimed they were in the meeting, but nobody was there, and they were waiting for the hostess to start the meeting. So fortunately, we had everyone on a single email distribution list, and we were able to send everybody a quick link to the proper meeting code and get everybody back on track and make up time. So no harm, just more embarrassing than anything. I'm going to just talk about the planning, the pre-planning for hybrid meetings. I think it's not uncommon to meet with your committee leadership to review the agenda, right? The content of the agenda before the meeting. But for hybrid meetings, it does take a little bit more planning on the actual logistics and kind of housekeeping items, and really thinking through how the chair or committee lead wants to run that meeting. So general rules and housekeeping are some things to consider. Attendance. If you have a very small group, then great, you can take a roll call attendance of those in the room and those online. But if you have a really large group, that's quite time consuming and may not be the best approach. So, it may be that you just want to take attendance of just those voting members in order to confirm quorum. And then for the observers, if you have 70 or 80 observers, they can just use the sign-in sheet, and then you could capture those online through the event registration or, on the participant feature in whatever online, service you're using. Same goes for motions and voting. Something to take into consideration. The chair needs to figure out how they're going to handle this. For straightforward motions or action items like approving the agenda, you can vote by consent, right? But if you have a large group and many action items, taking a roll call vote every time is quite time consuming. So the chair needs to figure out how are they going to handle that. And unless you have a camera in the room looking at the whole meeting space, the people online aren't going to know if people are, raising their hand, yay or nay, or abstaining. So it may be that the chair may want to just call out those members that did oppose, a vote, oppose a motion, or an abstained, and then call out the people online to get their, actual feedback out loud. Or maybe you want to consider just moving to a completely electronic voting format, or using one of those online polling tools so that it's the same for all members across the board. Just something to consider. For the discussion and Q&A portion of a meeting, it's pretty common for a hybrid meeting or a virtual meeting to maybe have extra staff to monitor the chat or the raise hand function. But I've had chairs that have been very successful with this hybrid format in that they actually specifically plan out how they're going to facilitate the discussion. So they may say, I'm going to take the first 2 questions in the room, and then I'm going to move online and call for the next 2 comments or questions online, and then alternate between the 2, just to try to make it more of an equitable experience and not have the people online feel like an afterthought. For the agenda format, if you have a 1 or 2 hour meeting, this is maybe not such a critical thing to think about, but if you have a half day or all day meeting, there's some additional factors that need to come into play. One example is your action items versus informational presentations. Might be a good idea to consider putting your highest priority action items at the top of the agenda. So in the case that you have technical difficulties, right, you run out of time or something happens, then you've gotten your most important discussion items out of the way first. Your presenters. Are your presenters in the room face-to-face, or are they online, or is there a combination of both? If you have virtual presenters, are they participating for the whole meeting, or are they calling in for only, at their designated time? Because if that's the case, it's really important for that chair to know that, and maybe have a staff member keeping track of the timing of the agenda so they can notify that presenter, if you're running way ahead or behind schedule. Or know in the back of your mind that if you are running off schedule, you're going to reorder that agenda, right? So that that presenter can still present at the designated time. You maintain the flow of the meeting without skipping a beat, just knowing what you're going to do ahead of time. Prompts for virtual participants. Again, I've had chairs just make little notes to themselves in the margin of their agenda to remind themselves to maybe call out for feedback for those online participants instead of waiting for them to interject, because sometimes maybe people not in the room are not as likely to speak up as if you were right there in person. And then finally, establishing a backup plan, just thinking through what could go wrong and what will you do if you get interrupted with various, whether it's technical or someone, failing to connect when they were supposed to present or whatever. Just knowing what you're going to do ahead of time just helps in the moment, I think, run a smoother meeting.
Excellent, Monica. Thank you so much. Next, we'll have Mark Czar.
Thank you all. Why don't I go ahead and I'll share my screen here. And I think you should see that. Well, again, I appreciate being given the opportunity to join in, and like Chris said up front, to be able to brainstorm perhaps as we go along ideas that other folks have had about hybrid meetings. But to me, the key to hybrid meetings is being an active leader. And what I mean by that is listening versus hearing. Hearing tends to be a passive activity. The sound goes in the ear, it goes around, it goes to the brain, and you understand that something is being said or heard, a sound is being made. Listening, however, is active. It's what you as a leader do with that sound. You process it. Do you do an action? Don't you do an action? That sort of thing. So as a leader during a meeting, you need to listen and not just hear. And with two groups, the reality is, and I think everybody kind of realizes this, that particularly those on the phone are going to be in and out of the meeting. Even if they're scheduled for an hour or two, half day, a full day, people are going to multitask. I mean, let's be honest. They're going to be distracted. Somebody's going to come by the desk. There's going to be a text that'll come in, an email that they need to answer. The boss comes by with a question. So mentally and physically, they're going to be in and out of the meeting. To some extent, the same can happen to those that are in the room. While they may be more consistently involved because they can't get away with leaving, they may be distracted as well. They may be answering a text or an email. They may be not taking a telephone call or putting you on mute quite like a person on the phone does, but they're going to be in and out of the meeting as well. So the leader needs to listen attentively, understanding this reality that you want to actively, and something that Monica mentioned, actively engage those on the phone, just as you might do with those in the room. You just have to do it in maybe a different way, rather than being able to look at the folks in the room or being able to call on people. You can ask for questions for those that are on the phone. You can repeat questions and summarize at points. What I mean by that is if somebody in the room asks a question and they happen to be away from the microphone or maybe not as understood as they might be for those on the phone, you might want to repeat the question so that the folks on the phone understand what's being asked. Don't be afraid to break as needed. Maybe you break every 45 minutes to an hour to allow folks on the phone to respond to emails, or for that matter, for the folks in the room to respond to a message or a text, to make a phone call. I think that allows folks to stay more attentive, knowing that there are going to be these break points that they can put off making that immediate response. And certainly there are probably other ideas too, but the idea is to actively engage, to listen, and then try to give the folks on the phone the same attention as the in-person response participants. The idea there is provide a concierge for those that are on the phone, a point person that's in the room that can accept comments, questions, feedback. For example, if the folks on the phone are having a difficult time understanding a speaker, have that concierge be the point person, rather than having a mass interruption or mass emails or texts or messages. That there's a point person in the room that can address the situation. It gives the people on the phone a direct conduit to the meeting. And for the staff, making sure those on the phone don't have to struggle to hear and read. Again, it goes back to what Monica was talking about preparation. Log on a few minutes at a time. Make sure internet is running smoothly, that audio is running appropriately, people can hear. We did that at this meeting. We logged in a few minutes early, tested audio, made sure internet connections were running and so on. Just that extra 5 or 10 minutes will pay dividends. It also helps you, as Monica mentioned, prepare for the worst. Yes, everything is working now, but we don't have to struggle at the top of a meeting. And certainly the concierge or following up during the meeting with those that are remote. Are you able to hear? Are the slides coming through clearly, et cetera? So that, again, they feel a part as if they were in the room as best they can. And certainly there's a post-meeting too. What worked, what did not work? What ideas maybe you had that would work differently next time? The meetings can be tailored to different organizations, different size meetings, and that sort of thing, so that a best practice book, if you will, could be put together. And certainly sharing feedback with the committee chair, the leaders, again, what worked, what didn't work, what we want to change, and certainly what do we want to do the same next time. But the bottom line is, I think it's being engaged with both the folks in the room as well as on the phone, how best to be able to draw the folks on the phone into the meeting, to not forget they're there. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chris. And again, thank you so very much.
Thanks, Mark. All right, Laura, you are next. And we're running quick ahead of schedule, so you have a decent amount of time, and I think we can spend a little bit more time doing the demo as well. So.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I'm excited that we have a venue to talk about this topic. It's certainly something that we've learned a lot about over the last 10 years. I think many of us have been forced to learn even more about over the past 2 years. So as Chris just referenced, as part of my comments today, I'm going to be demoing one of the tools that CGA uses for hybrid engagement as part of a discussion about equal versus effective hybrid meetings. So first, before I really jump in too far, I'm going to ask you all to take a minute and be a little brave with me here and participate in an experiment. So you should be seeing now a slide that asks you to either scan with your phone a QR code, or you can join through your browser at slido.com and use the hashtag OMF to join. It doesn't require any download or anything like that, but to answer a question about where you're joining us from today. So I'll leave that live for a couple of seconds here and let everyone engage. And Chris, I'm assuming you would tell me if that wasn't showing up. There we go. Looks like people are getting it. And while that's up, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself and CGA a little bit. CGA is a mid-sized standards development organization. We have 15 employees and about 150 member companies. In a typical pre-COVID year, we host about 600 to 650 meetings a year, and about 2/3 of those are web conferences. In normal non-COVID times, the rest of those are offered as hybrid meetings, and that's a practice we've maintained for more than a decade. Most of those meetings for us are committee and task force meetings with anywhere from 5 to 30 participants. But in the past 2 years, we've also hosted some larger events like hybrid seminars with 60 to 75, in some cases even over 100 participants. As far as the crash and burn story, several years ago, we had a board meeting. We had about 2/3 of our participants in person and 1/3 virtual. And there was some construction going on in the floor above us. And literally probably 20, 25 minutes into the meeting, we heard the sound that sounded like a grappling hook sliding across our ceiling. And sure enough, they were running wires for the new business that was being installed on the floor above us. And they managed to rip out every single network connection cable that we had along the way. So very suddenly, we went from having our very senior most committee together, our board of directors, to scrambling for a backup solution. So I guess if there's something to learn about that, it's always, especially in a hybrid meeting, to have a backup plan and maybe even a backup plan for your backup plan. We had to scramble pretty quickly to connect via our phones and hotspots for our laptops to get the meeting up and running again, and it was really disruptive for everybody online. All right, so it looks like a number of you have given the Slido a try. So I'll be testing this kind of as I go throughout today's presentation, just to give you an idea of some of the engagement opportunities that it offers for hybrid meetings. So thank you for being willing to participate in that experiment with me. And with that, I'm going to go back to sharing my slides for just a second here. So my topic today is equal versus effective. For a lot of years, CGA strived to make hybrid participation for remote participants as good as in-person attendance. We invested in really high quality audio systems. We worked with our staff to make sure that we were engaging people. But in those years, I think we might have been making a really simple mistake. And that was failing to realize that despite our best efforts, remote participation is never going to be equivalent to physically being in the meeting room. There are lots of different elements at play, from potential distractions of being in an outside environment, like Mark mentioned, to potential technology challenges. And really, the more we thought about it and the more we talked about it, some of our remote participants in particular voiced to us that they had different needs than what we thought they did. They didn't necessarily want to be in a full 2-day committee meeting as a remote participant. They were choosing remote participation as a way to make their experience more effective and kind of to manage their time commitment to the meeting. So when we acknowledge that hybrid meetings create an environment where a remote participant is not likely to have and may not even want an equal experience to that of an in-person attendee, it allowed us to embrace making their participation effective. And in doing so, we really had to challenge our assumptions about meetings and explore some new options to facilitate an effective meeting for both the remote and the in-person participants. So a couple of key points as we thought about that. Number one was thinking about what we could do outside of the meeting. Things like circulating more detailed agendas and reports in advance to facilitate preparation and give hybrid participants a clearer view into the discussions. It allows people to make a value judgment about whether they want to invest the time in the in-person portion of that meeting versus participating remotely. And for those who choose to participate remotely, it gives them an idea of some of the topics that they may be the most interested in and really want to participate in. And it makes it easier for them to follow along during the meeting. For all participants, regardless of being remote or in person, it makes it easier for them to prepare for the meeting and make sure that they have the positions and the materials and the reviews done that they need to have a successful meeting. One of the other things that we shifted to in the last couple of years is pre-balloting decision items. So particularly for publications, one of the things that we've been doing is where we have really heavy lists of proposed changes to our standards, we were spending a lot of time going through in meetings to have a unanimous approval of a change of a decision. So we've started pre-balloting those so that the ones that get unanimous approval prior to the meeting are considered resolved. They're taken offline, they are handled. As long as there's unanimous agreement and not a request to raise it for discussion at the committee level, we don't need to spend the real estate of a live meeting time getting into those. That allows us to focus that in-meeting discussion time on areas where there are disagreements or significant comments to be considered. And it really does make a more efficient use of the meeting time for both sets of participants. We've also been experimenting quite a bit with providing collaborative workspaces for work to be done on demand. This looks like for us using file sharing services during draft development. We recently debuted a collaborative whiteboarding service for our board of directors as they were going through a very strategic discussion. And it allows people to do work offline in the times that are most convenient for them. Since many of us are managing committees of volunteers, it really does make sense for people to be able to do some of that work on their own time, but to work collaboratively as a group as appropriate. So just for a second, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to throw up another question using Slido, just so that you get an idea of what type of capabilities this type of software has. So let's see, I'm going to go and share that screen back a little bit and let everybody fill that in while I talk about the next piece. And that's modifying your meeting plan to really consider how your hybrid meetings should be different. So Monica spoke to this earlier, but one of the things that we have found really helpful is working with our committee leadership to front load critical discussion and decision items so that they occur early in the meeting. This gets people when they're most attentive, when you have about really an hour and a half to 2 hours of focus time for those remote participants. It makes sure that you're getting all of those critical discussion items taken care of early in the meeting when people are most focused. An alternative approach to this too is to allow people, and we do this in some cases, to tell us what items they're most interested in, if they're only interested in an item or two on the meeting agenda. And we'll have a staff person let them know when that item is coming up in discussion so that they can jump on the call for just that event. But it really does take some consideration of the remote participants who may not be invested in participating in a half day, full day, longer committee meeting. Then we're doing tools like this, like the one that you see here, Slido, to promote interactive discussion and collaboration, and really to level the playing field between those in the room and those participating remotely. One of the things that we found over the past year using Slido with a few of our groups is that if we push people to use this as their Q&A input, as the way they're giving feedback throughout the meeting, it really does pull in those remote participants and give them a more level experience with the people in the room. You don't have to worry about people not being able to hear the questions being asked because they're all here in this one tool. And one of the things that's kind of cool about this too is that if you use it for Q&A, they're able to upvote the questions that they most want to hear. So if somebody's asking a question that's on everybody else's mind, a lot of people can upvote it, and you know that that's a comment or a question that needs to be addressed at a higher priority than the rest. Finally, and Mark spoke to this, but using staff support to bridge the gaps between in-room communication and remote attendees. Things like having someone who can answer the online chats and questions. I've had to go so far as basically live tweeting a meeting because the audio wasn't working as expecting, and summarizing the major questions and discussion points so that people on the phone could understand and still participate, still effectively be part of the meeting. It just really helps to have someone to manage engagement tools, to encourage committee leaders to summarize discussion points, and to really work with your committee leadership to create those intentional pauses or those intentional outreaches for remote attendees to chime in. So thank you. I'm going to switch my screen back for just a second here. And then finally, one of the things that I think gets missed sometimes in this discussion is, as Chris mentioned earlier, acknowledging that hybrid meetings are a pain, but one of the things that we have found really essential to engaging our committee leadership in hybrid meetings and making it feel like less of a painful exercise is discussing and defining how we can use hybrid meetings to achieve some of the specific goals that we've set out as an organization. And so for us, one of those things has been we've really wanted to grow the amount of young professionals involved in our committee discussions, but a lot of them don't necessarily get company support to travel and attend meetings in person. So for us, we set out some goals around growing our young professional participation. For your organization, it might look like growing participation in meetings in general. It also makes our work more accessible. One area that we had some challenge points with prior to really building these practices was getting kind of intercompany cooperation and feedback on standards, and thinking about how we can put things online, make things more accessible and collaborative. It's expanded the audience and expanded the feedback into our standards, which gives us a better end result. And finally, it makes it more accessible to our international partners. We have a really large harmonization effort as part of our standards development program. And so having a hybrid meeting format has allowed us to more effectively share and engage with our international partners. And having those conversations and kind of having a conscious view of what are the benefits, how can we use this to our advantage, it doesn't make hybrid meetings go any smoother. It doesn't take away the technology challenges, but I think it keeps everybody a little more invested in the success. So with that, I have one more demo question that I'm going to put up on Slido for everyone, if you'll bear with me one more time. And thank you all for engaging on that. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we've used this. So we'll go back over here to the Slido screen for anybody that needs to grab that. So I'm demoing this today, but this is really one of many tools that you can use. And you can see you could use this for voting potentially. You can use it for requesting and gathering feedback during committee meetings. There's lots of different ways, and there are as many technologies as you can throw a rock at to really engage people in your committee meetings, in your discussions, to really give the remote participants a sense of engagement, to level that playing field so that everybody's kind of at the same level, and to bring them into the meeting instead of leaving them on the periphery. So Chris, that wraps up my comments. If there's anything else that I can provide as far as the Slido demo, please feel free to let me know.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. This is excellent. I think you know, you all have probably seen Slido before. This is not an advertisement for Slido necessarily, but certainly an effective tool that we've experienced in a couple of different venues, and I'm sure that there's others too. But I think one of the important points is that something like this really helps with that hybrid meeting engagement tool, right? Number one there on the list. And the fact that it works, you know, interactively, both with you know, people in the room and people who are remote is pretty cool. So, I guess maybe just a quick question, Laura. You were talking about, and I think we've seen some other questions about sort of like the whiteboarding type stuff. I think, have you had any experience using a whiteboard, and how has that gone? To me, it seems like that would be more of a tool that you would use for a smaller group, not necessarily something like ours where we have 120 people. But just kind of curious if you have any thoughts or experience doing that. And our other panelists too, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so Chris, we actually used something last week. We're going through a strategic planning exercise with our board of directors and wanted to do a SWOT analysis on some core areas of our operations. And so we used a tool called Mural. And again, this is one of many of these types of tools out here, and they all have their own pluses and minuses. I would say I think this type of tool does work better in a small group. It works more, for us, our experience has been that it's more effective in kind of spitballing, brainstorming type sessions. This is not something that I would use necessarily for development of specific standards content, but maybe a standards outline or kind of a gap analysis on publications in a certain area. But we had, I mean, I'll admit, I debuted this last week with our board of directors, and I was pretty nervous. They're our most technologically reluctant group that I manage. And I thought, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if they're going to get it. But this allows any number of people to come into your workspace, and it's as easy as them clicking. It starts a new sticky note, and then they can do, this is a test. And everybody's able to see that live. And for us, it's been, we've used this in very limited circumstances, but it's been a pretty good tool. And it really has helped people. I think one of the things that we all noticed as much as anything, especially last week, it helped people that are normally really quiet in a meeting be able to participate kind of safely and feel like they could stick their thoughts on the board without having to speak out loud or break into the conversation. They could just kind of throw it up there, and it can be, you can set your board to be anonymous if you want to. So that was kind of interesting for us.
Great, thanks, Laura. Mark or Monica, any experience using the whiteboard or other hybrid meeting tools like this?
I would say I've used, MS Teams. We use MS Teams internally, so you could actually have the live document up there, and multiple people can be in a document editing at the same time. That's been really helpful. As far as just even getting that engagement of people, I like what you said. I would reiterate even just the simple chat function. People may be willing to post an opinion or give an idea in chat when they don't want to speak out loud. So really, those are just kind of the tools that I've used.
Great, thanks. Mark?
Actually, I think we're probably maybe a little more simple. Many times we'll just have the document itself that's being worked on, the standard, up and use Word. Sometimes using, and again, sorry for I know I'm in a bit of the shadows here. That's a bit of the orientation of the desk to the window. But sometimes using just the basic tools, the PowerPoints and the words, tend to be a straightforward way to provide these ideas. And certainly, as I think it was mentioned by Monica and Laura, that after the fact of being able to post the documents using track changes, for example, with Word on a website that folks can access and look at after the fact is frankly we found to be a very effective way to go.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. Hey, Laura, we'll put you on the spot here, maybe kind of in the background. There was a question about different types of platforms. And again, we're not promoting or pushing any particular platform, but I think it'd be interesting to use the Slido here in a couple minutes, maybe to ask people, are you using Teams, GoToMeeting, Zoom, WebEx, things like that. Feel free to be creative, Laura, if you want to queue up something like that. It might be fun for us to do an actual hybrid meeting activity here. So we had a question, I think also Scott from, let's see, I can't see the full thing here, but Scott also mentioned Miro, which I had not heard of before, which is cool. So I'm direct trust. So thanks for mentioning that. Kelly Cox had mentioned Remo, and I have been I'll make a quick mention of that. We used Remo for a couple of SES events. And one of the things that I think at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the biggest challenges that we were trying to figure out, a lot of organizations, so trade association, membership organization, where you're trying to, one of the benefits or the value that people get out of being part of your organization is networking. And one of the things that we had found a lot of problems with was, simple web conference platforms often have it's hard to structure or to set up any kind of networking type of function. How do you provide that same kind of capability? And Remo is a platform, one among many, I would say, that does have that type of capability to offer some kind of a networking type function where you have people at tables and you're able to join a table, and then you can, they have like speed networking rounds where there's a timer that's set, so you get shuffled every 5 minutes to different people. So anyway, again, just things that I'm not sure if any of our panelists have had experience with Remo or something similar, but curious to get your perspective there. So.
And Chris, I did just launch a question about web collaboration or meeting platforms through Sdos that people can answer there as well too from the audience.
Thank you. I will respond.
Yeah, I can talk about, we've used lots of different platforms and collaboration tools, some of which have been more successful than others. In addition to Slido and Mural, we've used Google Docs, we've used Trello, we've used a software called Idea Boards, a kind of networking-based software called Wonder.me. There are dozens upon dozens of different collaboration-based softwares that you can use. And I think the real thing is to identify the goals that you have for collaboration and then look for a tool that has the features to support those. Because it's really easy to get lost in the shiny world of new technology systems without that in the background to inform your decision.
Hey, Mark, you had mentioned something about having a concierge, on-phone concierge, and that being valuable. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience there?
Sure, thanks. It is, you know, invariably in a meeting, especially larger meetings, something will happen. Somebody is going to have, there'll be audio difficulties. Somebody wants something repeated. Where did you find this? Where did you find that? Where did you know, how can I reference that? To have that point person, or to have a point person in the room that folks on the phone can go to is maybe the next best thing to being there. And again, I think it was well said that being on the phone, it can't replace being in the room, but it certainly, the next best thing is to have somebody in the room for you. Even the comfort of knowing that there's a person that you and as on the a phone participant can, a remote participant can go to, even if you don't have to, knowing that person is in the room and is there for you can be kind of comforting and maybe a little more engaging, because you know there's somebody there that's watching for messages, that's interested in your participation. It can add and enhance that experience. So that's the point. If a person on the concierge can reach out too, does anybody have any questions? If you do, please let me know. I can get information to so-and-so that's speaking. Try to be encouraging with the folks that are remote. So that's the idea of, you know, you think about your experience at a hotel. You know, you've got that person that's a go-to, that is there, that can help you with different situations. If you've got questions, if you've got difficulties, just knowing you've got that person there sometimes can be awfully comforting and make you feel better about your stay at the hotel. The same thing in the meeting. So does that help, Chris?
It does, yeah. Thank you. I mean, Mark, you talked a little bit about you know, kind of that leadership and active listening, and I think a big part of effectiveness in hybrid meetings is putting yourself in the shoes of the people who are your audience, both in person and remote, and being their advocate, right? So I think sometimes, especially maybe the leader of a meeting who is not as experienced, can sometimes forget that there are people on the phone. So, you know, we're talking about best practices for both leaders and staff. I think sometimes, you know, whoever is doing most of the talking, if you have somebody else who's kind of maybe the person who is the kind of the reminder of, hey, let's make sure we take a break because we've been going at this for a while, or hey, there's, you know, 5 people on the phone. Let's check and see Just as kind of a reminder, oftentimes the person who is up front leading, they've got 10 things going through their head. And if you have somebody who's kind of that, that backup staff person or that co-chair who can be mindful of the other aspects of things that you've been planning for, I think is a really important aspect. So
I think you're absolutely right. And I think maybe as things unfold, organizations maybe are going to be watching travel budgets, even when, let's go back, we go back to normal. Let's all hope we do sooner in the near future, that organizations are going to be looking at budgets, at discretionary travel, things like that. So a lot of meetings may have actually more participants remotely than in the room, so that it could be, rather than just 5 or 10 people remote, it's more like 20 to 50 remote, and you may have a relatively few number actually in the room. So I think that may be a help too, that we do need to pay attention and meet the needs of those folks that are on the phone, because they could be the majority of our meetings going forward.
Thanks, Mark. A quick question for our panelists. What do you think is one audience need that gets forgotten when organizations are planning hybrid meetings? Maybe we'll ask Laura that one first.
Chris, in our kind of reevaluation of meetings, one of the things that I found us falling victim to, and that I see in a lot of places, is an extreme focus on either one group or the other, the remote group or the in-person. I think it's really important to acknowledge that the people that have made that investment to come in person get frustrated when a meeting is constantly disrupted by, I can't hear you, can you say that again? And likewise for the people who are trying in earnest to participate remotely, if your singular focus is the people in the room and the remote participants are a bit of an afterthought, they have a really frustrating experience too. So I think really specifically thinking about the needs of those two audiences, and maybe even having conversations with your members around what do you want as a remote participant. Like I said, we were surprised to find out in some of the conversations that we've had, they don't want an equal experience to an in-person participant. And so keeping just the fact that those two audiences may have a completely different set of needs so that you can have a plan for how to address those is really important, I think.
Thanks, Laura. Monica or Mark?
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. She said it perfectly. I mean, It's really just revisiting, like, what are the actual needs of the experience for the person online versus in the room, and balancing that. Yeah, it's I would say that things have gotten better, and even though hybrid meetings are a pain, I think now that we've gone through this whole transformation of having to have even just virtual meetings, I think when many of us now go back to the hybrid meeting, I think it will be improved, because I think we've all learned a lot just by trial and error in the last couple of years.
All right, Mark, do you want to add anything?
No, absolutely. I think you're right. It's just understanding that you've got two groups of folks, and you may have people calling in because they can't spend the day. So some of the ideas of putting more important items up front and things like that, just have to kind of keep that in mind.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. So question from Nathan Phillips, recommendations from panelists and poll feedback indicate extra staff is important for a smooth hybrid meeting. Do the panelists have any guidelines or recommendations for minimum staff required?
I would say at a minimum, in addition to the person, if you have standard staff or secretariat taking actual notes, right, meeting minutes, you're going to need at least one extra person to be monitoring that chat and raised hand function. And also, that they have admin rights, that they are, or if they're a host host, authority per se if something goes wrong. Usually 2 people can, between that, take notes, run PowerPoint slides as a backup and monitor the chat. But I would also say you probably, if you have a large meeting and if you're on site, you might need an IT person or whoever would be in charge of your system, as it not necessarily like tied up in the meeting all day, but on call, just on call, that they're available. And you know that in the case if something does happen, that they're available to come in and quickly correct the situation.
I think from our in the OMF fall meeting where we talked about hybrid meetings, there was a great suggestion from ASTM about, and this has to do with just managing the technology. If you have a large group of meetings all happening at the same time, staggering the start time for those meetings, maybe give yourself kind of a 15-minute rolling start for 2 groups at a time, instead of having 8 separate working groups all starting at the same time. And then having a roving staff person who can go in, who has the comfort level and the expertise. I thought that was a fantastic suggestion when you're managing a much larger group, so that you have that time to adjust and rebound when things go wrong, because inevitably they will. And so that, in combination with that concierge idea, I know that in some of our meetings, we have, one of the first things that we do is send out a list of cell phone numbers for the staff, so that you can send us a text or give us a call if, during this meeting, things are going wrong and you just need a little bit of extra help. So, all right. Peter from American Wood Council says, does anyone have experience with having hybrid meetings in a hotel meeting room where, say, 20 people are sitting around a table and 20 are trying to join online? Our annual technical meetings have usually been face-to-face pre-COVID and have been all via GoToMeeting for the last 2 years. This summer, we're looking to have a hybrid setup.
Actually, Chris, I'll jump in. I
Please.
Have had experience recently doing hybrid meetings out of a hotel. We happen to be committees that met in Florida. And one of the keys there, obviously, is working with the facility, the property up front, letting them know what you've got going. Most good meeting-centric properties will have AV people that you can talk with and can consult. They know the rooms. They know what the rooms are capable from a technical standpoint, like high-speed internet. Should it be cabled internet? What kind of AV equipment do they have? If you need projectors and screens and that sort of thing. So the bottom line there is working with your meeting planner at the hotel or the property. I would also say too that you probably want to deal with a property that is used to doing meetings. If you're dealing with a hotel that's mainly, shall we say, lower cost, mainly for business, I'll call it business travel, not business meetings, you may have more difficulty trying to get set up and that sort of thing. So I suggest trying to go with locations that have conference rooms, that have meeting planners, a meeting planning department, and it could be out of a banquet area, that have AV technicians. And again, it may be on site or they have an exclusive with an AV company. That's probably, to me, the key. Again, working in front, and then being able to invariably, I think you just said it, things will change. Not that they go wrong, but they will change. Somebody needs a laptop because they weren't able to bring theirs. A bigger screen, the LCD projector that somebody thought they could bring, they couldn't. So trying to be able to have that type of staff on site, to me, pays big dividends. And then set the room appropriately. Are you going to have 20 people? You want it in a boardroom style, or is it better to have it in classroom style, you know, working with maybe your leaders and so on. So again, it's all a matter of trying to think ahead.
Yeah, Chris, I can add, we've had some experiences with offsite meetings and hotel spaces, and I think Mark really hit on a lot of the key points. Some of the things that we found that really have affected the quality of the meeting, particularly for the remote participants, have been the room size. We've had some absolutely monstrous, cavernous meeting rooms where it was really difficult to get good quality audio. So it really is thinking through the audio equipment that you're going to have available, the internet connection that you're going to be able to use to broadcast the meeting, and then the physical layout of the room to make sure that you've got all the components of success there. That was, I'll admit, that was a really frustrating experience. We had a high-level board person that wanted to participate in our annual meeting remotely, and they, you know, every 5 minutes it was, I can't hear you. What was that? Can somebody say it again? And it was all entirely due to the room configuration. So just really thinking through, making sure that your hotel has something more than the most basic model Polycom or speakerphone for you to use in those meeting sessions. That's all really important for those externally hosted events.
So I have maybe a quick follow-up for the group. I think a couple of questions have circled around this, but like, so for example, you know, if you have one camera that is, you know, focused on the crowd, may not be necessarily effective for the remote participants. But then if you have everybody, you know, so for example, let's just say we're using this Zoom account and we're in a hybrid setting and we have everybody in the room using their camera. Inevitably, you're going to have audio challenges because you can't have everybody with a live mic or you're going to start getting feedback. So I'm just curious if, you know, or maybe other participants as well, you know, does allowing participants who are in the room to join the virtual meeting and turn on their camera, does that make sense? Or is that just a bad idea? And I think some of it has to do with internet bandwidth. I know in a recent ANSI meeting, it was virtual and the guidance was turn off your camera because it's just chewing up the bandwidth and it's going to slow the meeting down. So, you know, please don't. But I'm just curious, you know, if you do have, you know, unlimited internet access and at high speed and, you know, does it make sense for you to actually do that? And again, you know, it's around like everybody turning their own laptop on and then doing video so that you can have the option to see who's talking and that kind of thing.
I can speak to us. We don't encourage that for a couple of reasons. We've had major bandwidth issues when we've had a lot of people join the meeting online on site. And also it kind of opens up the world of distraction of having the laptop open if they weren't otherwise planning to have it open. We in our meeting rooms, we have a camera that tracks voice and mouth movement, or in some of our meeting rooms, ones that's steerable by the meeting administrator. So we either use the automated feature or someone in the room can direct the camera to be more focused on who's actually talking to give people a little bit more of a one-on-one experience.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. I agree. I would only think it would work for smaller meetings. Large meetings, I think we would discourage that as well. But or at least you could focus the microphone and or camera just on a specific speaker, you know, at a time, but not available for the whole room.
Sounds good. Looking in the chat, looks like there's some agreement on, I guess some of the job. Again, not advertising for any particular brand here, but looks like a couple folks have had some experience using Jabra hands-free conference units. It looks like smaller meetings is probably the way to do that. You know, that it's more effective for small meetings. Yeah, maybe some experience with some of your larger meetings. How do you manage, you know, I guess there's kind of a cost trade-off when you're in a room that has, you know, if you go to a hotel And, have you had experience with microphones either for every person or maybe every two, and then connecting that to the web conference? Have you had experience with that? And has that been effective?
Are you going to speak, Laura?
We have. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to keep jumping in. We had a super antiquated system for a while that we dragged to every hotel meeting that was wired and really difficult to handle. And we have very recently upgraded to a more modern wireless system. It does help, but it requires constant reminding in the meeting to activate your microphone if you're going to speak. Constant reminding to deactivate your microphone when you're done speaking. Also, it helps tremendously when everything is working as expected. Those microphone systems are not immune to the technology challenges that sometimes plague these meetings. And so sometimes it's almost as important to know when to walk away from using them.
Monica, do you also have a?
Yeah, I was just going to add, and actually my colleague from NSF looks like she just chimed in on the chat. We originally had started, like, say, for our meeting room, not necessarily at a hotel, but the system with the large speakers in the ceiling. And we had all kinds of trouble with the audio feedback, right? If they were loud enough for people to be heard, you're going to get that really chalk, or fingernails on a chalkboard kind of screeching sound. So we moved to the little tabletop microphones where you actually have to push the button to be heard. And so in between every other person. So we invested in, one for, in between every other person. And it has worked well. And and if you could have something portable like that, battery operated, that you can take to the hotel and use as well, that has worked well.
Sounds good. Thanks.
And bring extra batteries. You can never have too many. Make
sure everything's charged. I think Laura had an experience with that as well.
It goes back to pre-planning is everything.
Sometimes as many of the big details as you can take care of, because those small details will crop up. I see somebody moan in about a phone line being installed an hour after the meeting started. Specific timelines. Again, building a relationship with your meeting planner, with the property staff, letting them know what you've got going as best you can. I'll bet you a lot of times they've done these meetings before. They understand it and get it, and trying to build that relationship ahead of time and communicate, and emails and all that. And I'm not, if it's over communicating, so much the better. I have no problem, like I say in the meeting recently, making sure, hey, do we have this in place? How have you done this? Is this room good for? That pays. I mean, the ultimate is being able to do a checkout trip. Go down when the meeting is being considered, look at the facility yourself, seeing what it looks like, talking with the folks. And this particular meeting I'm thinking of, the meeting planner that I was dealing with resigned from the facility about a week, 10 days before our meeting started. So that can happen. But on the other hand, a lot of the major details were taken care of so that it transitioned rather smoothly, but that can happen. So as much as you can do up front, so be it.
Hey, just a quick note, Michelle, I'm getting behind on the chat. So if you see something that we need to jump in on, please feel free to. I'm gonna hit a couple things here real quick, but there's a bunch stacking up here, and I just want to mention a couple of these real quick. And also, we will allow for people to use their voices. So if you just didn't feel like typing and you want to speak, please hit that raised hand button, and we'll be happy to call on a few folks. We are doing okay on time, so feel free to do that. One thing, Scott from Direct Trust, online participants we have had at meetings indicated shorter meeting sessions and shorter days work better. I think that's a really important thing. I think we all learned that through going completely virtual, but I think that still applies to doing even hybrid meetings. So, you know, and also paying attention to time zones, I think, is also really important. I think Mark mentioned it, but we also, let's see, Caitlin, TCNA, practice meeting with the AV people at the hotel where we run through everything to make sure it's working. I think that's a great idea. Good reminder there. Michelle, any items that you think are, as I'm reading through here?
There's a few people that asked about if they had experiences on breakouts, whether it was, I think, even virtual or even on a Zoom kind of platform. So if anybody wants to chime in, whether not only the panel, of course, we can have people raise their hands if they want to have any best practices to share there. Everyone hates breakouts.
We do them more with our young professionals group than anybody else. They are, you have to have a plan, I would say, for how you're going to use your breakout, how you're going to disperse people to it, and how you're going to bring them back from it. We made a mistake the first time we attempted to use it without really understanding kind of the clear steps, and we've done a couple more successful events since then. The one concern, I think, for us that we recognized as we started using breakout sessions in some platforms was making sure that we had enough staff coverage for a staff person to be in every breakout session for antitrust reasons. So it was really making sure that somebody was there, but also to help with any technology issues, any questions like that came up. But breakouts do add a staff-intensive requirement, at least for the way we run them.
So here's, go ahead. Do we have, sorry, I'm trying to get back to my participant list here. Okay, let me just, here, I think this is a great question. Have you found that there is a minimum percentage of committee that you need to attend in person in order for the hybrid format to be more efficient and effective than fully remote? Man, what a great question. I mean, think about, hey, we're gonna have a face-to-face meeting and everybody decides to do it remotely, and you have, you know, 3 or 4 staff members who are sitting in a hotel in LA and everybody else is remote. Wow, what a great use of resources, right? So how have you got, I mean, and this would be, you know, kind of applied to the rest. How do you make sure that you have the right number of people in the room?
I guess I can chime in. I mean, that really hasn't been an issue from my experience because we have advanced, you know, RSV or advanced registration, right? So we know in advance. If you're going to travel, you know in advance, right? You have to buy your airfare and get your hotel accommodations. So I would say you know, and actually what we've done up until this point, as we're starting to test the waters, right, to go back to face-to-face meetings, we've been really all virtual this for the last 2 years, is that we're polling people, you know, a year in advance. We have annual meetings for our larger committee. We're kind of just testing the waters and saying, would you be interested in attending a face-to-face meeting? And if we do decide to have a face-to-face meeting, do you plan to attend? Are you able to attend? Because they may be willing to attend, but they may not be permitted by their employer or agency to attend. So I think though it's not an issue because we know well enough in advance of our annual committee meetings anyway. The smaller task group meetings, we tend to run all virtual. So that's not really an issue.
Absolutely. I think I had a group earlier this year that was talking about wanting to do a face-to-face meeting in May or June, and we were discussing this back in early January. And you know, in the discussion, I said, let's be honest. You know, who is going? And to Monica's point, who's going to be able to travel? Not, you know, we know you're interested. We know you'd love to meet face-to-face, but let's. Who's going to be able to travel? Who's going to be able to get authorization, whose companies are even going to allow some discretionary travel. And when we, it became apparent with the members that many were not able to give a answer then, and maybe not even able to give an answer in a month or two, kind of when the meeting cutoff time might be for room reservations in meeting rooms and so on. And I think it just became apparent to the committee members that it wasn't going to happen. So it was decided not to go with a hybrid, but to go virtual only. So I think you have to have some very frank discussions up front.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that we've also found is really emerging as we come back from COVID is a lot of flux in people signing up for in-person and then changing out to webinar participation. One of the things I think that we found helpful, we've only had a few hybrid meetings with an in-person component in the past year. But we've been really open with committee members about the in-person participation in the couple of weeks leading up to a meeting so that they can make a value judgment on whether they still want to come in person or not. So, last year for our board meeting, we scheduled it in the summer when things were looking really good with COVID. We had almost 100% in-person participation. And then in the weeks leading up to our board meeting, we had almost a 50% reduction in in-person participation. So we just sent an email and said at this time, X number of people are planning to attend in person, X number of people are planning to attend virtually. If you need to adjust your travel plans, we understand, and we'll provide web conference participation information for you, so that they were aware, they weren't surprised to walk into a meeting room with less than the number of people than they expected, and they could make a decision based on that information.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that aspect of communicating. Just make sure you're communicating well in advance. Yep. So another comment here that just caught my attention, Peter Portella said, we have moved away from projectors, and for many of our meetings, even in-person participants join via Zoom, so everyone has the same experience of seeing the screen and content. I thought that's a pretty interesting concept and idea. I know that for some of our larger meetings, we've spent the time to make sure we have a projector there, but that's kind of an interesting idea. How you have your own screen, and I guess that's kind of bandwidth. It could be bandwidth intensive, but just making sure, yeah, it's an interesting idea. So thank you for that suggestion. Michelle, any others that you catch your attention here? I'm scrolling through quickly to try to make sure we don't miss any good nuggets here.
We have some good comments, which we can also compile, like just people stating things that work for them. We can add to a list after the meeting, but also if anybody would like to raise their hand, we can open you up and unmute you. And I think you actually have access to unmute yourselves, but if you raise your hand, we can get a queue if anybody would like to share their experience directly and not just the panelists. We're happy to do that.
One other thing, I'm seeing a couple of different people mentioned in the chat talking about the risk of not having enough attendees at a hybrid meeting if it's offsite, about piggybacking on another industry event, which I think is a great idea, because if you're going to meet when another larger meeting's meeting anyway, right? We hold most of our committee meetings on site, but the offsite meetings that we do hold typically are in conjunction with another industry event or some other meeting, which I thought was a great tip.
Andrew Davis brought up an interesting point here about hotel bookings and organizations taking on the risk there. Some organizations have chosen not to allow hybrid attendance. I know that an organization that I may have worked for has certainly chosen to do things like that in the past. I think that, I don't know, I think Laura mentioned it too. We're gonna be in a period of flux as we kind of figure out what's next. I think we got a flash in the pan where we thought, COVID's over. and then we had Omicron, right? And so I think hopefully this time, we're going to emerge a little bit better. But I certainly think that we're going to be in interesting times where we're going to have to be really careful about hotel room blocks and just what, and I think as much as possible, allowing for hybrid participation. I know for us that we have had people who for many, many years, were not able to participate because they didn't have the funding. Some of our government participants in particular started participating, and we've had some great interaction and feedback with them because we opened things up, but also kind of watching the room block numbers and making sure that we're still going to be able to meet. I know that there's, in a sense, some pent-up demand for meeting face-to-face. So, we are proceeding with caution and kind of keeping all that in mind, but definitely things to think about and consider. So, all right. Let's see.
Yeah, Chris, if I can, while you're looking at the chat, we are one of those organizations that doesn't always allow hybrid. Our annual meeting is a good case for that. And this year we are actually for the first time offering hybrid components of our annual meeting, but not the full annual meeting experience. And part of that decision was to drive in-person participation. We wanted to offer certain aspects like our keynote lunches and kind of the broader industry events to the audience that we've managed to connect with over the past 2 years. But we really took a hard look at our annual meeting and didn't feel like we could provide an adequate and effective experience for both the in-room participants and remote, with all the kind of unknowns that come with a large hotel space. We knew we weren't going to be able to get down there and do a dry run with the equipment. And so we did make a decision. And I do feel like that's an important part of the conversation, is understanding what makes sense for your organization, for your members, for your event, and deciding what pieces might make sense as a hybrid meeting rather than the whole in some cases. And we have also really recently arrived at a distinction between hybrid events that are truly meant to consider experiences from both sets of participation to in-person events that offer remote participation. And we've communicated those differences to our members where we can. But for us, there's definitely a difference between a hybrid event where we're really trying to bring people together and help people collaborate from different spaces, and hey, we're hosting an in-person event, but you can call in if you want to. And that's been an important consideration for us for some of our larger events where we have those hotel commitments.
Sounds good. Oh, I did want to mention, so when we were preparing for this, and we got a little bit specific into the staff and leadership preparation, and one of the things that that I wanted to do was to make sure that we had, just provided some resources to people as you're thinking about doing your own meeting planning. What is kind of the checklist of things that you need to think about? So our OMF chair, Ed, was thinking along the same lines, and he put together a fantastic presentation, which was not necessarily intended to be displayed here today, but really as a kind of a thought piece for you to walk through as you're thinking about your putting on a hybrid event. So I believe Michelle is going to send that out to the OMF after this meeting. But I would encourage you to take a look at it, because I think it was really helpful. As I was looking through it, I actually started taking notes like off to the side, like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that part. And we've talked about a lot of these things here today, but I think it's different when now you're, even if you've done a lot of hybrid meetings, there's some things in there that I think you'll probably pull out some nuggets as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So. All right, last call for any hands raised. If you want to use your microphone, welcome that. Otherwise, I think we're probably might end a few minutes early, Michelle, unless you have other administrative, or Sarah, if you have other items you want to raise.
I don't see anything left in the chat. Like I said, we can add this to, you know, the thing that Ed's presentation that we talked about, and some of the tips that people have put into the chat to include that. And then I don't see anybody else that has it.
Looks like we got one more question.
One more question. There you go.
Okay. Do you find that in-person attendees have greater influence over decisions than remote attendees do? If so, should Sdos be concerned with the balance of interest categories among the in-person attendees? How does this affect the decision to run hybrid meetings? Good question. So do you find that in-person attendees have greater influence over decisions than remote attendees? Thoughts from the group?
I can chime in. I could say in general, no, that my committee chairs have done a really good job of engaging those people online, making sure their voices are heard. And the way our committees are run too, the official votes on actual changes or revisions to a standard are done electronically after. So the actual, revisions are happening electronically after. It all comes down, it really does come down to that committee leadership though, and making sure that you are engaging those people online.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, Monica. I think Barry, good question. I think that is certainly something to be watchful about, making sure that your staff and committee leadership are mindful of that tendency. I think certainly it's easy to forget that you have people online. So Laura, Mark, any other thoughts on that question?
Sure, Chris. I would say the thing that Monica raised in her response that I think is really important for everybody to reconsider as we kind of embark on a new period of hybrid meetings is your procedures. Do your procedures need to change to allow a longer balloting period or electronic balloting so that everybody's on the same footing and has the same opportunity from a voting standpoint? I know there were some comments in the chat earlier about concerns with that. For us, for our organization, that's part of our ANSI procedure to offer that electronic balloting for a period after the meeting so that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate. Certainly during the meeting, there is a tendency for the in-person voices to drive the conversation if there's not a focused effort at drawing in the people who are participating virtually. So that's an important role for staff and committee leadership to take. But I would really encourage everybody to think about your procedures and how those might need to change to create an effective hybrid experience as well.
Mark, did you want to comment on that?
No, absolutely. I think that's a great comment, is to make sure that your procedures, your policies are up to date, are hybrid oriented, because we're not going to be moving away from them. If anything, it's probably become more prevalent.
All right. Sarah, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Chris. And I want to thank our panelists. Again, just for the audience, I am Sarah Yerkes. I'm the Vice Chair of OMF, and I represent the International Code Council. On my behalf, and Ed Makowski, our Chair of OMF, I want to thank the panelists, Monica, Laura, Mark, and Chris, for today's panel discussion. I think we got a lot of great information, and I see quite a few strings of topics of continued interest, like policies on voting, breakout rooms, and so on. OMF plans to continue this series of panel discussions on hybrid meetings. We will be doing another survey to find out exactly what topics we should focus on. We have some topics in mind, and here from this discussion and from the chat room we saw topics that seem to be popular. or of interest. Platform browsers, pros and cons, breakout room sessions, how to conduct, effective issues for consideration, using hotel conference rooms, that was quite discussed today, but there's still important considerations like block of rooms and so on, sharing costs, planning for these events, hosting on premises, what are the most considerations when planning, and again, the voting tools and possible demos, particularly for those of us who are in codes and standards organizations, and those votes can get very controversial and popular. So those are very important subjects. So please let us know what do you want us to discuss next. And I want to thank all the participants that joined us today. Thank you for hanging out here with us this afternoon or morning, depending if you're in the West Coast. And again, on behalf of ANSI and all of us here, thank you so much for today's discussion. And Michelle, I don't know if you have any final comments you'd like to make.
No, thanks to all of you. We're very appreciative, ANSI, of all of our members that help out and discuss these timely issues. As a reminder, we did record this. It will be posted on ANSI's website once we just, do our little magical editing to make sure that we didn't get the beginning and the end there, that when people are signing off. So it will be posted there. And again, you'll see information from me coming about future meetings and of course about our regular spring OMF meeting. So stay tuned for that. And again, thank you all. Thanks especially to panelists, Chris, Sarah, everybody for leading us through this. We appreciate you all, and have a great afternoon or wherever you are. Enjoy it.